Okay, welcome to this slideshow on post-colonial interpretations. Um, Again, quite a sort of daunting way of looking at text for some students, but again, it opens up many texts in a really interesting way in relation to the history of colonisation and the way writers deal with racial identity, ethnicity, etc. So a little bit of background about what we mean by colonisation and colonialism. Um, the 19th century, actually from the 16th century to the 19th century really, was an era of colonisation by European powers like Britain, France, Germany and Russia. And attitudes to race across these centuries really ranged from patronising views of different cultures and races to outright racism, and indeed slavery, or in slavery of colonised peoples, and in some cases murder, genocide. During the 20th century, you saw a collapse of those European empires. English speakers in countries which had once been colonised started to voice their views about their experiences of colonisation for the first time. And of course they'd been taught English, so they started explaining in English what English and other colonial cultures had actually done to them. So post-colonial identities started to emerge. So you get voices from these colonies starting to speak. And one of the things they started to speak about was English literature, which many of them had been force-fed and taught in the schooling systems in colonial countries. Some key words or terms that might be really useful if you get your teeth into this form of critical reading. Just the word colonialism itself, really important to understand the act of colonisation. So controlling another culture or group. Post-colonialism is post-colonial just means the act of coming to terms with what colonisation actually did to people. So living in a post-colonial world or looking at a text from a post-colonial viewpoint. The term ethnicity is also very important in describing a group of shared traits, beliefs, norms, tastes, cultural memories that create a particular group identity. It's not always explicitly based on race, so ethnicity is more than that. It's an identity, a more broader identity. The term exoticism is quite important if you're looking at text from a post-colonial viewpoint. So the act of a coloniser viewing the colonised as different in an exciting and alien way. So again, it can seem quite sort of patronising in the way that the colonising culture looked at the colonised. The word ideology would be a good one to use, a shared belief by a group that is taken for granted as inherently true. The Christian faith would liberate and civilise people, for instance, not necessarily inherently true, but certainly an ideology that British colonial people certainly had an amount of belief in. Hybridity could be a term that you employ if you spot where transcultural forms arise from mixing cultures, so a more positive aspect of the way that cultures start to merge during a colonial period. So those are some key terms to do with post-colonial theory. So what's this got to do with reading novels, plays and poetry? Well, post-colonial critics believe that literature, novels, poems and plays reflect the societies they are produced in and therefore the realities of colonised and colonising peoples. They reveal characters' ethnic identities and how ideologies encourage how people perceive other races and cultures. So a sophisticated reader of literature might be a reader who considers what role does race and ethnicity play in a text? How does the writer analyse ethnic relations and identities? How do characters challenge colonial control? In what ways does the work serve as propaganda for colonialism, or does it try to undermine it? What does the work say about oppression of minority cultures, or are ethnic conflicts kind of brushed over and ignored? Does the work propose some form of solution to racial or ethnic inequalities encountered in the work? Now, again, with the other sort of critical interpretation clips, I focused on a quote from Macbeth. I might instinctively think, oh, post-colonial, I can't look at Macbeth. Of course I can, and in some ways, and from a post-colonial view, it's crucial to the play Macbeth, the relationship between the English writer, William Shakespeare, and the culture that he's writing about, which was Scotland and Scottish Celtic culture in the medieval period. So he's writing about the history of another nation from certainly the perspective of a colonial power. And indeed, once you start to think about the play Macbeth, the English are the ones that put Malcolm back on the throne and defeat Macbeth. So there is a colonising aspect to the play, which is pretty central once you start to think about it. So, using my sentence starters, which are quite general and hopefully fairly accessible, I feel the presentation of the characters' attitudes to race is progressive or regressive as. Text reflects the attitudes of the time in terms of race as. I feel the author's attitudes to race. You could use the term ethnicity actually as a better term, I think. Are, because, etc. So, here's my example. I feel the presentation of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is arguably interesting to look at from a post-colonial viewpoint. Viewed as butcher and fiend-like queen at the end of the play, Shakespeare perhaps presents a regressive view of the indigenous Scottish population as primitive and primordial from an Anglo-centric viewpoint. The text reflects the attitudes of the time, as although James I, a Scottish king, became King of England, indigenous Scots were still stereotyped as unchristian heathens by many English writers, including to some extent Shakespeare. So it's very brief, but it shows you the kinds of things that you can start to think about. To what extent is Macbeth viewed as someone who is inherently Celtic and Scottish, and obviously he gets punished in the play at the end, and it's about his flaws. So you can see it from a colonial point of view. An English writer writing about a Scottish villain is quite easy to access in terms of that kind of reading.